Okay, we're going to make a start. I'm sure some people will be coming in, but we'll kick off now anyway. So my name's Amy. I'm from the Alumni Office here at King's. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our 12th Annual Alumni Weekend. If this is your first Alumni Weekend, welcome. We hope it's the first of many. And if you're returning, then we're really delighted to see you. So I'm delighted to welcome you to our talk, How to Eat Yourself Happy. And our speaker for today is Professor Tom Sanders. He is a Professor of Nutrition and Dietetics at King's. He's been at King's for 20 years and has a wealth of experience in nutrition. The title of Tom's talk is Dietary Guidelines, Have They Made Us Fat and Miserable? So it's taken a slightly different look at the question, but we also have handouts for you with some top tips on how to eat yourself happy. There'll be time for questions at the end as well, so do have a think about anything that you'd like to ask. And without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Sanders.
Thank you very much, Amy. I was a graduate of Queen Elizabeth College, QEC, the real place in Kensington. And I've actually been associated with the college on the stuff since about 1977. So a long haul, went through all the mergers with King's. And I retired last September as the head of diabetes and nutritional sciences. So I did 20 years as professor of nutrition. I thought that was long enough. Anyway, I've sort of the step-in act. I think someone else intentionally was going to talk on this, and I got rung up last week, so I'll do it. So I apologise for put together a bit fast, but it's something which is quite close to my heart. I'm often asked to comment in the media on stories about food. I used to do a lot of work in the past on BBC Food and Drink programme with Peter Basil-Jett, and wrote a couple of books with him. And I selected the topic of dietary guidelines because I've been looking at myself in terms of doing research. And there's a view, if you read the newspapers, that if you follow dietary advice, it'll make you fat. All the advice you've been getting is wrong, and people are pretty miserable about food. So I thought I'd look at that as a first challenge. So to give you an example, this is the Daily Mail. It's a newspaper I won't have in my house, I must say. When I was at school, my housemaster said the Daily Mail was a paper written by morons for morons. But there's been a series of articles suggesting that saturated fat, fat by animal fat, may not be as bad as it was thought to be. And articles and things like Time magazine saying ending the war on fat. And the new demon now is sugar. And there have also been other things about salt in food. We've had salt to food. Romans' empire was very much determined on about access to salt. They paid their troops in salt, and that's why it's called a salary, and that's why they're called soldiers. The word salacious is also related to salt as well. So salt is something we know raises blood pressure, but there's a lot of confusion about that. And then we have this issue of carbohydrates, good and bad carbohydrates. And one rather amusing thing I was doing on Today programme, and a report came out, and it was supposed to be about complex carbohydrates versus simple carbohydrates. And I think the John Timpson at the time said he referred to them as complicated carbohydrates, which I rather like. Well, my old professor at Queen Elizabeth College was John Yudkin, and he thought that sugar was pure, white and deadly, And this has actually come back into fashion quite recently. And then we have carbohydrates you absorb more slowly, called ones with low glycemic index, thought to be slightly better. So it's sort of getting quite confusing if you read newspapers and if you watch celebrity cooks. I mean, how many programs are there on a week in the winter that are about, MasterChef, cookery programs? I call it gastro-porn, actually, is the word I use. But, people are confused about this, and then we have other issues about what should we eat, and people are quite miserable sometimes about what they do eat. Oops, whoops, I turned it off. No, right. Now, the good side about carbohydrate, something which I learnt when I had a teenage daughter going to school, that low blood sugar in the morning caused extreme irritability, and anything, any sort of carbohydrate, even Cocoa Pops, frowned upon cereal, improved mood. And that's quite a well-established fact. If your blood sugar is low, fasting in the morning, you get irritable. My mother told me when I wanted to go and get something from my father, wait till he's had his lunch, And so mood is affected very much by what you eat. So people are in a better mood after food. Starvation also changes your mood. So a lot of religious groups have ritual fasting, and you get quite elated when you start burning up ketone bodies, which happens when you've used up all your carbohydrate. And your breath, on the other hand, does smell like a cow. But, people, that's a way it does affect mood. So that just shows us, in the short term, what we eat does affect how we feel. When you are very poor and down and out, George Orwell wrote about this in The Road to Wigan Pier, and he said when you're down and out, what you want is something that's a little bit tasty as food. There's a lot of truth about that. So we eat food to give solace. Some people will do it. We talk about comfort eating. Chocolate is, for example, is a thing that people do, is comfort eating. So it's something that it's a mouthfeel of the chocolate, the taste of it is sort of reassuring. We have a lot of research. I was in charge of a division to do with diabetes, and there's a huge epidemic of diabetes. It's probably about 4 to 6% of the population in the UK now, and it's rising as people are getting fatter. And we know it's associated with increased levels of body fatness, but there are some other foods that are associated with it. So meat consumption, particularly processed meat, is associated with a higher risk. White rice is associated with risk. Sugar-sweetened beverages are some quite interesting ones that have the opposite effect, which are green leafy vegetables and dairy foods and whole grains. Those are the sort of things you break your teeth on, whole grain cereals. And quite interestingly, coffee seems to have a protective effect. And in the past, we used to talk about there being food groups, dairy group, meat group, cereals, etc. Well, someone the other day suggested that we should have a new sort of food groups, bad for you but tastes good for you but tastes bad, and sort of eat it and die food. Now, eat it and die in my category is probably things like pork pie, or cheesecake. There are also a lot of quite cranky ideas about food, and this is sort of this is from Borough Market. You can get wheatgrass. I like it. It's equivalent to 1 week's green vegetables. But people have always had these views about food, and this is an information material by the Lard Information Council in America. So they're happy because they eat lard. So the idea that families would be happy by what they eat. And then, you could lard, it's not something I would recommend, You could make a claim for it saying part of a calorie-controlled diet. So we also have this ongoing debate about butter or margarine, and we have singing cows, and butter is seen to be something entirely natural, whereas margarine is something produced by the devil, the devil's spawn, I think someone's referred to it as being. And there's an ongoing confusion about this area. Some of it's been due to, with margarine producing things called trans fatty acids, which we found out are actually bad for health. But these haven't been used in margarine manufacture for about 15 years now. But still, people still bring this up. But I think what it comes down to is actually about taste and familiarity of foods, why people like the idea of butter, They see the rural idyll, they see cows, nice pastures, etc., fresh-faced dairymaids, etc. Whereas margarine is something like produced in a nuclear power station almost. Now, Ben Goldacre and I published a paper a few years ago. It was an intercalated medical student wanted to do some research. We were quite interested in looking at the quality of claims in a newspaper for health, nutrition-related claims. So we randomly selected a week in the year, and we looked at for every nutrition claim in the major newspapers, and then we used the systematic way of classifying them as being convincing evidence, probable, possible, or insufficient. And we found actually most of the stuff in newspapers are absolute garbage. So, be careful with what you read in the tabloids. They are looking for stories every day, and quite often there are press releases put out by people who've got an axe to grind, or they're launching a book, or sometimes it's a piece of research coming out. What I want to move on to now is really this epidemic we're seeing in the Western world of obesity. And we refer to it being as an obesogenic environment, which is we have an environment where it's easy not to take any physical activity and there's plentiful abundance of food. And this chap here is obviously very keen on fast food outlets, as you'll see, KFC. Colonel Sanders is no relation to me, I just to make that clear, okay? But it's particularly what we call high energy density, tasty foods. And we have this appalling epidemic that's occurring globally. And whatever government's been doing about it, it's not really having any large impact on obesity. And at the same time, while we have this obesity epidemic, we've got this huge problem about eating disorders. The estimates are just under 1 million people have eating disorders. It mainly affects women, and the most common forms of eating disorder are sort of bulimia and binge eating disorder. So some people will tie their hair back, get the big piles of chocolate out and wolf the lot down. That's sort of binge eating, or tubs of ice cream. Anorexia is a little bit more complicated. It's not so much to do with concern about body shape and body image, but it's all about control. And quite often this affects younger women who are very bright, and they one thing they can absolutely control is their diet, and they'll be weighing lettuce leaves and things like that. Absolute control. And anorexia is really quite a serious problem, because a lot of girls who develop anorexia actually do die, either from starvation or suicide or other psychiatric problems. So it's a big problem. And on the one hand, we have all these health messages about obesity and how much food you eat, and we have the other side of the scale where people are concerned about their body image, their body shape. And if you ask women to look at their body shape and match it up on a scale from fat to thin, women always tend to put their body shape is 1 or 2 notches higher than it really is, and they tend to select a thinner shape than actually is healthy. So there is a problem, and it's not helped by the media. France has recently put a ban on models being recruited who are below a sort of healthy weight because they're concerned about this. But it's a major cause of unhappiness to do with food. Some years ago, I wrote a book which is called You Don't Have to Diet, and one of the things we did then, and I borrowed my daughter's Barbie doll, and I did some measurements on her. And what we realised that Barbie was a physiological impossibility if you translated her into real shape. And I think there is an issue here from a very young age that women are given an idea about attainable body shapes and about success. And this makes them have rather unhealthy attitudes towards food and feel guilt about eating certain types of food. And I think there's a real need to regain, what normal eating is in our society, because food is a really important part of the way in which we live and communicate together. We spend a lot of time eating together. Well, I have a saying that families that eat together stay together. They may kill each other on Sunday lunch, but generally it's a good thing to eat together. It's important social cohesive effect. So look at going back to sort of weight and mood. Are people fat and happy, or are they thin and miserable? Well, we've now got some research from a study of 1 million adults who took part in a genome-wide survey, and they've looked at levels of fatness and self-assessed health. So do you feel healthy? How healthy are you? And it's quite a good assessment of health. You may have read in the papers a few weeks ago, you could work out your chance of dying by asking how many cars you've got in the household, how you assess your own health, and whether you smoke, a few things like that. Anyway, before we go on to this, just explain the term body mass index. So it's your weight divided by your height in meters squared. So if you're overweight, you're short for your weight, effectively. So if you're underweight, we say less than 18.5, but seriously underweight would be about less than 16. But where we want to be is in this range 18.5, 25 to 30 I'd call plump, and then 30 plus we call obese. Over 35 we call clinically obese, and you're likely to have a lot of medical problems developing in time if the people are very obese. And we've got growing numbers of people who are in this red category now. And if you look at, from this survey, what they found, they looked at body mass index here. This is in men. So you can see this is reported health. So the people who are actually underweight are actually not very healthy. The people in normal weight are fine, 25, 24. The ones who are plump, up to about BMI of 27, are okay, and then their risk goes up of ill health. And when they're very fat, they really are healthy. Now, if you look at how they perceive the mood and happiness, then you can see thin men are unhappy. They're not happy with being very thin. And at the other end of the scale, you can see it go up a bit. You can see a little bit more if you look at body fat. So you can see quite a big jump. So men being very fat, they seem to be unhappy. But generally, really, the effect isn't actually enormous of being fat or thin or mood compared to its effects on health. Now, in women, slightly different. The surprising thing is that there's actually not a huge effect on women of fatness. So being fat in women, if anything, the more miserable people are the thin ones, not the fat women. So it seems to be more socially acceptable for women to be can be fat and happy, but men are not so fat and happy. So I'll tell you some things about obesity. It's related to the number of hours you watch TV. Okay? And in the UK, obesity really took off from about 1983, and that's when daytime television started. Whether it's just a coincidence, I don't know. Computer technology means that many of us have reduced physical activity. You sit in front of a computer all day, and you might be picking away at food, whether it be dried fruit, nuts, crisps, or whatever. So people can... I have this term which I call biscuit amnesia. You have a packet of biscuits, little biscuits, and you eat one. Then you go back to look for the other one, and it's gone. So people can get in a little bit of a habit watching TV or with computer, eating mindlessly, not actually thinking about issues about feeling satiety. And the final thing is people talk about a lot of interest in genetics, but I think the argument against this is that fat people have fat dogs. and they're not genetically related to dogs. So it tells you either about they're rather generous with the portions they give the dogs, or they don't take the dogs for the walk either. But fatness, in terms of mortality, isn't quite as bad as cigarette smoking. And if you look at mortality rate, it's J-shaped. So being underweight, both in smokers and non-smokers, associated increased mortality. And actually being plump increases your risk, but not as much as being obese. But it's actually certainly better not to smoke even if you're fat, you know. So you're actually at lower risk if you're fat and non-smoking than a lean smoker. So I mentioned this obesity epidemic, and I say women are more likely to be overweight than men, and the figures have gone up. They stayed roughly around about 25%. They have since about 2011. They haven't no sign of going down. Some people are saying, you know, 75% of the population will be obese. I think it will probably settle at about 33%, is my guess. What is worrying, what we're seeing, is a huge number of admissions into hospitals for obesity, and this is mainly due to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, but also conditions like sleep apnea, which if you get very fat, you can stop breathing at night, and it can be fatal. So where we're seeing this increase particularly is in the 45 to 74 age groups who've got fat. Where the under 16s, although they're getting fatter, they're not really landing up in hospital. What I've learned as you get older, your chances of getting diseases and things, or disorders, are much greater. And the big thing about weight is, the big risk about being overweight is developing type 2 diabetes. You can reduce some of that risk by being physically active. 30 minutes brisk walking a day helps. But in terms of mood, what we've discovered is that if you get a diagnosis of diabetes, you're much more likely to get depressed. And there's a study which we call the SOLDI study in South London. Stephanie Amiel, a colleague, has done with people in Institute of Psychiatry, and the finding that the diagnosis of diabetes is associated with depression. So if you can stop getting diabetes, that will make people happier, okay? Because depression is a big, big problem. And the other problem is that some drugs used to treat depression, or more particularly bipolar disorder, cause actually weight gain and cause diabetes. So there's a bit of a double whammy on that as well. So what we eat, body size, has effects on our mood. And we think this is probably due to signals produced in adipose tissue, hormones produced by adipose tissue called cytokines, that have effects on mood. When you talk about obesity, much of the public health emphasis is actually focused on young people, and rather than treating the obese. So we have all these school meals programs about healthy eating, and one of the problems about this, it sort of does fan the flames a little bit of eating disorders as well. And I think what we're trying to do is get people to have the idea of eating a healthy, balanced diet, and not being over-obsessed about body image. The bad news is about, in terms of people who are overweight, is that you can initially lose weight quite successfully, but most people pile it back on within 3 years. And one of the issues is really confusion and self-delusion about food intake. If you ask people who are overweight how much food they eat, they lie. And we know this because we can measure the energy expenditure using double-labeled water. And we know that your energy expenditure is balanced with your energy intake if you're not gaining weight. And we find their energy expenditure is actually quite high, and they say they're eating nothing. And And there are these things like I mentioned biscuit amnesia, but the other one, I think Victoria Wood said, food eaten standing up doesn't count when you're on a diet. So there is this problem about sort of discounting things. We know similar things happen with alcohol. People tend to underestimate their alcohol intake. The other thing they do is over-exaggerate physical activity. They say, yes, I walk lots of time, I play lots of games. But if you put a pedometer on them or an activity monitor, you find actually they don't do much. I mean, the activity is probably the TV controller, is the only activity they're having. We've had a series of diets promoted. So we have low carbohydrate diets came fashionable, back in fashion again. High protein diets, Atkins diet, so carbohydrates were blamed. We've had the other ones, the low fat diets of Rosemary Connolly, pushed for many years. But basically, if you want to lose weight, you just eat less. It's simple as that. And the tip I give to people is that you use smaller plates. And have you noticed how big plates are and cup sizes are when you go around to supermarkets trying to buy things? They're all made for Shrek. They're absolutely enormous. And when we have people who've had gastric surgery, what we do is we give them child-sized plates and say, don't change the plate size, have smaller servings. And that's part of the key to it. But buffets are not a very good thing either. All-you-can-eat buffets. If you watch people at breakfast and they pile their food up high, why do they do it? They're overweight to do it. It's because it's free, it's accessible, and I'm going to get my money's worth sort of idea. But there is a sort of cultural shift in a way in which it's come okay to do that. So I mentioned about weight loss, and this is what happens. Control group, just give people advice. They don't do anything. If you get them to do exercise, they initially lose a bit of weight, but they put it back on again. If you put them on a diet program and you make them stick on a diet, you get them to come back in, something like Weight Watchers or things. People will lose weight, but they tend to creep back up. They don't lose a huge amount. You starve them on very low calorie diets, give them about 600 calories a day, they drop the weight, but they gain back up, and you can give them drugs. Well, some of the drugs have got side effects. So sibutramine, this one here, brown, did work quite well, except made people suicidal. So the drug got removed. So the side effect of the drug was to make people very unhappy. The other one, orlistat, which is one that inhibits the digestion of fat. And one of the side effects of this is anal leakage if you eat fat. And so people are advised who take the drug to wear dark trousers. So these are not very nice ways of doing it. So at the moment, we think diet and exercise is the most effective. And for people with very severe obesity, surgery is the thing that does work. The interesting thing about surgery is that it does make people lose a lot of weight. We call it bariatric surgery. But it does also change their mood as well. And one of the long-term effects that's happened with the post-surgical things is actually people are actually quite miserable and become quite reclusive and not wanting to go out and engage with people. Sometimes they're so fat, it's the folds of skin that make them feel they can't cover it up. So it's a real problem, this weight. The best thing is to try to avoid getting too fat in the first place. Now, the newspapers have been full of stories about fat and said, we've reduced butter intake and we switched to semi-skim milk. And people say semi-skim milk or skim milk tastes like chalky water. And it's true, fat intake from milk and butter seems, if you look at statistics, to have gone down. But what they don't tell you is they don't throw away the butter and the skim fat. They stick it in other products. So you go and buy your buttered croissant or your ice cream, the fat is going back in there. So although it's come out of one part of the food chain, it's going back in somewhere else. And what we're seeing particularly now are these muffins and cakes that are high in fat and sugar. So this is butter icing, And you go on any station, go to Waterloo Station, you see these muffins. They're quite often 500, 600 calories a throw, okay? And those foods are what people are snacking on. And then they wonder, so, why am I putting on weight? Sugar is a problem, but it's only really a problem in sugar-sweetened beverages in kids. And in the States, people have these enormous beakers of Coca-Cola, and sort of lorry drivers will drink, 2 litres a day of it. In this country, it's not so much a habit. For adults, a bigger problem is actually drinking booze. That's where they're getting the excess calories from rather than sugary drinks. But in kids, there's quite good evidence that actually sugary drinks are making kids fat. And there's a problem that people have actually forgotten to drink water. Your hydration needs are best met by drinking water. And one of the things I think I said on media last year is that, banish sugary drinks from the table, just have a jug of water on the table. It becomes a habit to get your hydration needs from that. But it's almost people have been convinced that you can't get hydrated unless you have something out of a bottle. So we have this peculiar situation where we have, Jamie Oliver on one side with his cookery programs and his series of books, and the other side we have Ronald McDonald out here, which is the quick serve thing. So Jamie is passionate about food, he tells me, and he's all into cooking things for primary products. Most people feel time poor now. They want convenience of food, and so are buying more and more food ready prepared for most of the time. If they do cooking it the weekend, it's what I call hobby cooking. And they're snacking on the hoof. And a lot of these fast food franchises are actually very high calorie foods. And you're also encouraged when you go and eat there to actually eat more than you want to. So they say, what else? Would you like to upgrade to a large portion of fries, Or for a penny more, you can have a big biscuit with your coffee, 300 calories. So, and this boy here perhaps typifies, part of the problem. A bottle of pop here, a big bag of crisps or something on the table, sitting and watching TV. And this is what's happening to many people. And kids are teased when they're fat at school. So it doesn't make for people to be happy to be putting on weight. So talk now about these dietary guidelines, which have really been a target. People are saying the dietary guidelines we've got are all been wrong. All this stuff about fat is wrong and it's all sugar. But if you look at the dietary guidelines, these ones for Americans, they're quite similar to the UK. It says balance calories, physical activity to manage weight. Okay, it's sensible. What goes in has got to be balanced by what you use up. Eat more certain foods, so they say, more fruit and veg. We have a campaign, 5 a day. Whole grains rather than refined cereals, low-fat dairy, and seafood, so fish. Fish is seen to be good for the brain as well. And then sort of the things to avoid are saturated fat, salt, trans fats, cholesterol, added sugar, refined grains. Well, Americans go on and say, the dietary guidelines are all wrong. But fewer than 5% of Americans actually follow these guidelines, so they can't say, the guidelines are really wrong because they actually haven't followed them. And it's quite interesting. We started on this project a few years ago, and we found there's actually no systematic evaluation of trial of actually the dietary advice that's given out to the general public. So people came up with these figures, less than this, 5 a day of that, eat 3 portions of this, and actually no one had actually fed normal people this food compared with a conventional British diet. So we did this study, which is called Cardiovascular Risk Reduction Study, it's for short CRESIDA, and it was a study done in sort of 40 to 70-year-old healthy adults, older people, and we chose to do it in non-smokers because smokers lie about what they eat as well. And what we were measuring also were some of the measures of vascular function which are affected by cigarette smoking. if people say they're non-smokers, we find typically 10 to 15% are actually lying about it. And we did blood tests on them to measure a compound called cotinine to check they really were non-smokers. So not only do people lie about what they eat and what they drink in terms of alcohol, they lie about tobacco as well. So this is what we call parallel study. So we had two groups of people. One who's allocated a traditional British diet, so you could eat bacon, eggs, butter, full cream milk, sausages, all those sort of things, not a huge amount of vegetables, white bread, you could have cornflakes, etc. for breakfast cereals. And we had an intervention group where we modified the diet to fit in with what the dietary guidelines were, which is more fibre, more fruit and veg, less saturated fat, less processed meat, less salt. And we took various measures in the mid-time to measure in blood whether they were really complying, whether they were lying or not, the diet. And at the end of the study, we got them to measure their food intake again. We did some psychometric assessment of actually how much they liked the diet compared with the control diet. So our guidelines were to cut salt down from the usual level, cut saturated fat. It's mainly from meat and from dairy foods. Eat more fruit and veg. Eat at least one portion of oily fish a week. Whole grain, but we didn't, particularly we wanted about half of their grain to come from whole grain. And we did that by mainly changing the type of bread or rice they used and changing breakfast cereals. And then less added sugar and to get the fat down. And the sort of way we did it was we gave people dietary advice and provided them with information books, but they had follow-up meetings with a dietitian who reinforced that advice and said, well, and she tailored it very much to what individuals' preferences were. So we had Afro-Caribbean, we had Asian, we had white European sort of diets as well. And to help this study, we provided them with some fats. We need to control the fat. So we either gave them a butter-rich spread, I think we used Lurpak, or we gave them a spread that had a lower saturated fat, rather like fluoromargarine. And we gave them whole grain cereals, things like muesli or porridge oats, versus things like cornflakes or Cocoa Pops. And we gave them some fish. So the control group, we gave tinned tuna because there are none of what we call the omega-3 fatty acids we thought were protective in tinned tuna, but plenty in salmon. We gave salmon to the other group. And we gave our intervention group some reduced salt varieties. And what we did swaps. So with snack foods, we said, well, okay, if you want a fatty snack, we'd say nuts in the healthy group, chocolate biscuits in the other group, so Kit Kat or something. And we'd try to get people, when they were eating more fruit, to swap that for things like eat fruit instead of biscuits. So these are just sort of lists of how we did it, and we told them to drink moderately, okay. And both groups were given advice. Don't go and pick out lots of sweets, and so it was sort of sensible advice. Anyway, at the end of the study, what we found, we got effects on blood fats, blood pressure, arterial stiffness, inflammation, basically all in a favourable direction on the intervention group compared to the control. And we reckon that would reduce their risk of cardiovascular disease by about 30% in the next 10 years. So that's really quite a substantial impact. The other interesting thing is they actually lost a bit of weight, and without actually trying to diet or restrict energy intake, and their waists went down particularly. And we know with diabetes, the big risk actually is your waist circumference. So we talk about women should be less than 80 centimetres and men less than 94 centimetres is what your target is. When we asked them about, did you enjoy the diet? They said, yes, I really liked the diet. It was great. So, you know, the Dietary Guidelines diet was perfectly acceptable. It didn't cost any more, but it was about making choices. So to finish off, I'll say, you know, have dietary guidelines, as the newspaper said, less of fat and miserable? Well, the answer is no, because most people don't follow them. We know from people who do actually follow guidelines and healthy advice that actually do live longer. and probably long enough to make a legacy to King's College, don't he? And obesity and obsession with body image are the real main targets, I think, whether can make people unhappy. And they're all about our relationship with food. And we need to have a much healthy relationship with food. And I think dietary rules, like dietary guidelines, are really important in formulating a diet, balanced diet for a good health. The trouble is the word diet has been hijacked by the diet industry, be it some sort of restrictive, nasty thing. So basically, you know, diet books come and go every day. Okay. Thank you for your attention. I can take a few questions if anyone has any.
Could you say a bit more about butter as against low-fat spreads? Is butter as unhealthy as it?
Well, yeah, I mean, butter is produced from cows, and cows are animals that are ruminants, and they convert polyunsaturated fats in their diets into saturated and trans fatty acids in there. And both those are thought to be undesirable with heart disease. In the past, margarine was made using a process called partial hydrogenation that produced trans and saturated fat. Nowadays, most modern spreads don't use any hydrogenated fats, and they're made using things like sunflower oil or olive oil. And in terms of their health side, or what it does to your blood cholesterol level, they're better. The low-fat spreads are slightly better because you get fewer calories. So you get 9 calories a gram for fat. And they've got the spreads that are low-fat spreads have got half as much fat in. So you're going to get fewer calories. And given we've got a lot of obesity, it's fine. But I mean, I think in the past, some of the old margarines, you might remember things, used to be one called stork margarine in the past, and which wasn't very healthy. And that's the one people who say, couldn't you tell stork from butter? Yes, I always could. It had a subliminal, jaded taste, I think. Yeah. Lady, yes, you first, yeah?
I wonder if you're in agreement with legislation to tax
Taxing food. Yeah, I mean, there's a proposal that we should tax certain foods, so fat and sugar. Well, if you look at, in particular, in confectionery, it already attracts VAT at 20%, and so do soft drinks. If we put an additional excise tax on something like a can of Coca-Cola, which I think is about, is about 69 pence or something, push it up, it would actually make, without doing anything about alcoholic drinks, which are quite cheap, it'd make booze cheaper than sugary drinks. So that could be an undesirable, unintended effect. The other issue is actually, what would the government do with that income? Would it put it back in to subsidise more healthy drinks, like, low-calorie drinks? And basically the answer is, once the Exchequer gets its hands on the money, it doesn't put the money back into another area of food. It never has. It's like we have carbon credits or whatever for paying when you go on a long-haul flight. It doesn't go back into cleaning up the environment. With fat, they tried it in Denmark, putting a tax on fat, and people just drove across the border to do their shopping. So the other issue is actually how big the hike has got to be in tax to have an impact. It's what you call elasticity demand. It's very low on food. Food is incredibly cheap in this country. Where we spend most of the money is actually where we buy the food. So you can buy, for example, your can of Coke for 60 pence in Asda. But if you buy the same can of Coke on Waterloo Station, you'll pay £1.50 for it. So that doesn't seem to put people off buying things. I mean, people have got, food is very cheap. So I'm not convinced about that. This lady there. No. No, saturated fat raises blood cholesterol, and particularly from animal sources, and raised blood cholesterol causes furring up of the arteries, and then eventually you get cardiovascular. What we know in countries that traditionally have low intakes, like Japan, saturated fat, or the southern Mediterranean countries, which don't have low-fat diets, they have a lot of olive oil, they have much lower rates of heart disease, and we know that actually getting people to consume more olive oil and also follow a Mediterranean diet reduces their risk of heart disease. No one showed benefit of saturated fat. And they got it wrong.
I was talking about coconut products, which are high in saturated fat. Coconut.
Coconut. Oh, sorry, coconut. Yeah, coconut oil is very high in saturated fat, but they tend to be what we call medium chain fatty acids. There's a bit of an internet load of nonsense out there. People take tablespoonfuls of coconut oil with caffeine, and I don't know why, whether it's a laxative effect, but it's popular. But coconut oil does raise your blood cholesterol. It's probably the worst of the vegetable fats. In countries, tropical countries, where coconut oil was used, it's now mainly replaced with palm oil, which has got a slightly lower saturated fat level, more monounsaturated fat. So I think coconut, a little bit of coconut in your coconut biscuit or coconut cream is okay, but I wouldn't use it as my main cooking oil. That's what I told Jamie Oliver. It's going to be in his new book. Yeah.
A question about fat-free yogurts.
Yeah.
So is it around the processing that they put in to replace it? Is there a view on?
Yeah, I mean, normally with the yogurt, if it was not fat-free, it'd be about 4% fat. So the fat-free are normally less than 1%. They're using it skimmed milk. And you get something about the mouthfeel of fat. Its globules 2 to 3 microns in size give you that taste. And what you can do is you can process physically protein particles to have that size, and it gives you that creamy texture. And it's done just by physical mixing. And a lot of it's done with ice cream. So a lot of the modern ice creams actually have a much lower fat content. And they do it just entirely by changing the particle size. That you get this creamy texture. What you don't want, for example, in ice cream is crystals in it. But that's how the yogurt works. One of the issues about a low-fat yogurt, some of them are actually loaded with sugar. So in terms of your calorie benefit, there's not much in it. But I think yogurt generally is actually quite a healthy food. And so I think I don't have a big deal, but I personally like Greek yogurt. Yeah.
I think that the expansion of obesity in the population has a lot to do with the lack of education in schools in preparing fresh food, fresh ingredients. I'm of the vintage where we learned how to bake a cake and understood what was on our plate, and we actually had cookery lessons. And then that was done away with in schools for various reasons, and I can't help thinking that there's a direct link between young people, a lot of young people, they don't have the basic tools to be able to prepare a simple, healthy food from raw ingredients.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's some recognition, and the government has got this policy. It's called license to cook. I rudely called it license to kill, but it was, which is to make sure that kids leave school with some basic food skills. But having said that, cooks have a habit of being on the plump side and being exposed to food. Like if you're a bit publican, you're more likely to be an alcoholic. So having the skills in food doesn't necessarily guard you against overweight. I think it comes back to having quite a structured eating pattern, having breakfast, having a main meal and maybe a lighter meal, and not eating on the hoof. If I was going to legislate, I'd probably ban people from walking around eating in town centres. I hate that. I really hate people eating on the hoof. And I think what really gets me is clearing up bags of crisps that have been thrown into my garden over the wall or takeaway foods. I mean, I think there's something about, spend a bit of time eating, enjoy it. The French, spend a hell of a lot of time eating, and until quite recently, they'd bucked the trend on overweight, and so the Scandinavian, but they're now seeing it going up. Do you know there are more McDonald's in France than any other country in Europe? Interesting statistic I found.
McDonald's profits are tumbling. They're panicking at McDonald's if you can't earn as much as they were.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
All things considered, what's better for you, a quality piece of chocolate or a piece of fruit?
I think they have different functions. So I think chocolate quite interesting, you may have some health properties to it. And I think a little bit of chocolate that's quality and enjoyable, it's fine, but a whole box of chocolates hogged is not so good. So I think it's a matter of recognising those foods you are treats from, foods you eat every day. And I think what's happened, when I was a kid, we had party foods, and I used to love parties, and you'd go and get the sausages on sticks, and you'd get jelly and stuff, and ice cream. Now the party foods come everyday food. So I think, chocolate is, a little bit of chocolate, maybe in a meal, fine, but, slabs of chocolate. And some of these bars of chocolate, are a kilogram. And they say it's for sharing, give us a break. No one shares chocolate. A story my mother told me. She bought a bar of chocolate for her father, and she felt quite hungry, so she nibbled a bit off one corner, and she thought it was uneven, so nibbled a bit off the other corner. And then it got smaller and smaller, and she thought it's too small to give her, and so ate a lot. But I think the chocolate is a very Moorish sort of food. But I don't think there are no totally bad foods, I think. We say there are no good foods, bad foods, but it's about how much you eat of them and how frequently.
What's worse, a regular Coke with a sugar in, or a Diet Coke with a sweetness?
The sweeteners are perfectly safe, but a lot of people seem to believe in internet conspiracy. So in the UK, Coke's sweetened with aspartame and I think asulfame K. Pepsi is sweetened with the same. In America, they just moved over to sucralose, which is a sweetener invented at Queen Elizabeth College by Liz Huff, which, the college received a large chunk of money from Tate and Lyle for that. So we have a declaration of a vested interest here. No, they don't really make much difference. But if you're drinking, if it's just the occasional Coke, what I call the full-fat version, if you like, I don't think it really makes much difference. And when you look at people swapping diet drinks, soft drinks, if you just put them on diet drinks, they tend to compensate by eating more calories, eat up to calories anyway. So the occasional drink, I think it's fine. If you're drinking it regularly, I would say drink the diet version.
Stevia,
Stevia is a naturally occurring sweetener that comes from a plant called stevia. And it's actually an extract of a slightly modified version of it's got what they call a green label, so it's all natural, but it's not really. It's quite a complicated chemical. Okay, I think one last question. Yeah? Yeah.
Is that trying to figure out which is it simply eat less, move more, or which bit is related to the dietary aspect of weight loss?
Yeah, the weight loss is mainly driven by eating less food. By doing exercise, you help retain your muscle mass. And one of the problems if you get drastic weight loss, you lose muscle. And you want to retain muscle. So doing the exercise helps keep your lean mass up and just lose the fat. And doing moderate, what you call aerobic exercise, so once just gets your breath, heart rate going up, you can still talk, like cycling, walking, is the best exercise for weight loss rather than weightlifting or things like that, really. So it's not a huge amount of exercise, but the advice, I would say is, walk rather than, take the tube or bus, if you can do that on a daily basis, really. And exercise is hugely important for keeping weight off. If you want to lose weight, the key thing is actually to eat less. On that, I think finished. Thank you very much for your attention.